So for our second segment, we are talking about Twitter. Specifically, we're talking about the Twitter files. So Elon Musk built up a bunch of anticipation among his 120 million or so followers, claiming that he was going to release a bunch of sensitive material about Twitter's policies and actions regarding like the 2020 election. And what he did was he leaked some of these documents to journalist Matt Taibbi, who then released information from those documents in a like 40 thread or so like series of tweets, which I find to be a very fucking weird method of journalism. Like I found it very strange just reading through them. Like I kept finding him making assertions with no citation and no like according to it. Basically is a good way to just dispense with all journalistic standards, but that's always good news. They were really not what Musk signaled that they were going to be.
Yeah. Like, okay, first off, we need to talk about the entire premise behind this.
Yeah.
All right. Because already it's screwy. Because what Musk is doing is he's not making the Twitter files public. Mm-hmm. He's releasing them to two specific journalists who already have beliefs on this, who have already said that this is what they think is happening, this is what they think happened inside Twitter. So you're releasing it to two journalists that are already going to be working backwards from their conclusion. Mm-hmm. And you're only allowing them to look at it and to release their own interpretations of it on Twitter.
Yeah.
Via Twitter threads.
Yeah. And the threads that have been released claim to show blatant liberal bias in the administration of Twitter policies and the deletion of certain tweets. And Musk even claimed that this was a violation of free speech. And he put out a statement saying, quote, Twitter acting by itself to suppress free speech is not a First Amendment violation, but acting under orders from the government to suppress free speech with no judicial review is.
Yeah.
Which is quite a claim. If that's true, that is like a pretty fucking big deal.
Yeah. But it's not true.
No.
It is very much not true. Now, there's a lot of different angles to this that we need to understand in order to figure this out. And unfortunately, some of it, I think, does have to involve discussing the Hunter Biden laptop story. So I just want to do as quick as I can, overview of that story and what happened here. And I hate that I have to do it. Because I remember the thing is I had forgotten what the story was. I know that we covered it at the time, but I forgot how fucking stupid this whole thing is.
Yeah, it's fucking dumb, man.
So basically, the New York Post had printed an article in October of 2020 that had claimed that it recovered a smoking gun through files on Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son's laptop, that showed that while Joe Biden was the president, he had used his powers as the vice president to carry political favors with Burisma, which was a company that Hunter Biden was working for at the time. If that were true, that would be corruption.
Yeah, and almost as bad as all of Trump's corruption. But that wasn't in the article.
Yeah, that was not in the article. So here's the issue with that. So when it was first published, the author of the article didn't even want to put their name on it.
Yep.
Because a lot of the shit had not been verified.
Yeah.
And
like literally the laptop wasn't even necessarily verified as Hunter Biden's laptop at the time.
Until later.
It was just found at the exactly, at the time of the article being written. It was just found in like a New Jersey like computer store and turned over to the New York Post and through Rudy Giuliani. And it was like this very convoluted, very strange, suspect like chain of events and evidence.
Yeah, yeah. And really the most incriminating part that I would actually say does seem a little bit screwy is there was one email between this advisor on the board of Burisma and Hunter Biden, that was thanking him for, quote, inviting me to DC and giving me the opportunity to meet your father and spend some time together. That's it.
Yeah.
So if you want to argue that it's probably kind of screwy that, Hunter Biden was able to get a meeting with someone, with an advisor on the board of Burisma, to have a meeting with the vice president, make that argument. I agree with you. All right. Hell, I'll go even a step further. If you want to make the argument that the only way Hunter Biden got his job at Burisma was because his last name was Biden, I completely agree with you.
Yeah,
you want to
of
make the
course.
argument that that's bullshit? I completely agree with you. But the fact of the matter is, there was no evidence presented that there was actually an impact on policy.
Sure.
The thing that they keep pointing to was the fact that there was this prosecutor named Victor Sokin, who at the time was reported to be investigating Burisma. Turns out that actually was a lie too. It wasn't that he was investigating Burisma. It was that after he had been fired, which, by the way, I'd just like to point out, he was fired because there was a whole coalition of people from various Western countries that Joe Biden was representing that wanted him fired for corruption. And in fact, part of why they wanted him fired in terms of corruption was actually because he wasn't investigating companies such as Burisma.
Interesting.
So the claim was based on the fact that after Shokin had lost his job, he claimed that he was planning on doing an investigation of Burisma, but there was no open investigation. The only evidence is his word saying that he was definitely going to do that. But because no investigation had been opened, there's no way to corroborate that.
Yeah.
And the claim that he was investigating at them at the time is even contradicted by his own words, by the very evidence that they used. The whole Hunter Biden story from the New York Post was bullshit.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that because I love Hunter Biden or because I love Joe Biden. I don't. It was bullshit.
Yeah. And it dropped like right in 2020, like right before the election, pretty irresponsibly, and got a lot of attention and all that stuff.
Yeah. Now, all of that being said, I do not think that the story should have been suppressed.
Yeah. And so what Twitter's response was, after apparently a lot of back and forth, was to suppress the story on Twitter. Basically, any links to the story would like not work. Some people got their accounts suspended for sharing it around and all that stuff. It basically was marked as like an unsafe link. There was a lot of like back and forth on whether they should do that. There was like they were having, there's, with any social media in this day and age, like there's a lot of, can be a lot of coordination with like the FBI and Homeland Security and stuff like that around potential mis and disinformation from foreign countries, because we know that was a problem in the 2016 election, and all that stuff. And so like later Twitter was like, came out or Jack Dorsey came out and said like, hey, we probably shouldn't have suppressed it, which makes sense, especially in hindsight when it turns out that like it was his laptop and all that stuff. All that to say, like, Twitter made a decision, and then a couple of days later, they stopped suppressing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, it probably had our Barbara Streisand effect.
Yeah.
Where the story blew up even more because they suppressed it.
Exactly.
So it didn't even really necessarily keep the story out of people's minds, because it actually ended up getting more attention because of the suppression. Like the suppression became the story.
Yep. So now, they shouldn't have, but also like no one asked them to.
Yeah. Now, the issue is the internal discussions about that decision were based on the fact that there is a Twitter policy against hacked material. Now, there was one anonymous former employee that in the first dump of information was revealed to have said, quote, hacking was the excuse, but within a few hours, pretty much everyone realized that wasn't going to hold, but no one had the guts to revisit it. Now, what that sounds like is that there might have been some people in Twitter that made the decision, and it might have been for political reasons. Now, there's no direct links to that, but I mean, you can probably infer that from that statement. And I would say that is probably the worst version of this. Like, the worst version of this is that there were some people internally in Twitter that had certain biases that caused them to suppress that story. There's no evidence that is definitely the case, but of course, that very well could be the case. And if that is the case, that's wrong. All right? That shouldn't be the case. And I think that openly apologizing for it was the right thing to do.
Sure.
I think it shouldn't have been suppressed. And I'm glad that they corrected it.
To be clear, like it wouldn't be a violation of their policy to share a story that references hacked material. Like, it's not like someone's putting the hacked material on Twitter. So that it seems like a reasonable thing that it would just be an excuse.
Yeah. Another thing, though, because the Republican version of this story seems to be that the Biden campaign pressured Twitter to suppress stories that made him look bad or that made his son look bad. And here's the thing. If that were the case, it would not be a violation of the First Amendment.
Sure.
Because, number one, he wasn't in the government at the time.
Yeah.
And also, even if he was in the government at the time, it still wouldn't have been if there was no coercion. If they had just asked, hey, take this down, that would be screwy, but it wouldn't be coercion, and it wouldn't be a violation of the First Amendment.
Yeah.
But number two, Biden was not involved in the questions about this article. The only thing that the first dump was able to show, was that the Biden campaign had asked Twitter to take down a few tweets about Hunter Biden. And the thing is, Tybee, the journalist, did not give context for what was in those tweets.
Yeah.
Someone else had to do it. And when they looked up the archives, it turns out they were dick pics.
Yeah.
They were revenge porn.
Which is a violation of Twitter's policy.
Which is a violation of Twitter's policy, and I'm pretty sure is a violation of the law.
In a lot of states, yeah. Not every state, but a lot of states.
And anywhere that it's not, it should be.
It should be.
You
It's
should
fucked
not
up.
be allowed to do that. It is fucked
exactly.
up. It is the most reasonable thing in the world for the Biden campaign to be like, hey, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Like, you're not going to be publishing my son's penis without his permission.
Yeah.
All right? That's revenge porn. That's
like
wrong.
Basic. Yeah, exactly.
It's just basic shit.
And there's no value to that. There's no content to it. It is just like revenge porn. And the fact that this journalist would put out these, like, a misleading claim that somehow these tweets might have been like really important or like may have been leading to corruption or something like that, without clarifying that these were actually just tweets that would have violated Twitter's policy and should have been removed regardless.
Yeah.
It's just misleading. It's bad journalism.
Yeah. It's horrible journalism.
At its best, it's bad journalism. At its worst, it's like...
And again, our only ability to gaze at these files that Elon Musk keeps claiming is the smoking gun is through the eyes of this journalist, Matt Taibbi, and Barry Weiss. Two people that are both biased and have an agenda.
Yeah.
And they've demonstrated that thoroughly through this process so far. So on top of that, in an offhanded comment, they also admitted that the Trump White House also routinely sent Twitter content moderation complaints.
Yeah.
Which, that to me, is
it's way more screwy than a private citizen running for office asking for something to be removed, even if it was.
And for that thing to be dick pics. Now, one thing I will say is that, I mean, if it was dick pics of his kids, like if Trump was contacting them about dick pics of his kids, like, yeah, of course, totally makes sense.
Yeah,
or whatnot. But like, I want to know what was in those tweets.
Exactly. The fact that it was just like an offhand, it was like one tweet in this thread that was like, and both parties have done it, but the Democrats have benefited more because Twitter's liberal and biased and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And it was like it was so offhanded, and like there's obviously
Yeah.
so much more there. But
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
you know,
And
this
Elon
article
Musk is
biased in the
refusing
other
to release
direction.
it all publicly.
Yeah.
All right. Which I would say, if you actually care about the truth, then release it all publicly and let everybody look at it.
Yeah.
Like,
See,
I mean, I don't understand why you can't just do that.
Yeah, it's like it's so interesting to see such blatant hypocrisy in this like very act. Like they're claiming that previously, you know, Twitter was biased against Republicans and towards Democrats, and that the corruption angle was that Biden, using his position of influence, got tweets removed. And then right now, they are like, in the way that Musk is releasing these things to specifically like biased journalists, and these journalists writing these articles in explicitly biased and misleading ways, they're doing exactly like Twitter is putting itself behind Republican, like it put Republican bias against Democratic bias, and brushing under the rug the actual like potential corruption from the actual executive at the time of like asking for these tweets to be removed. It's just like, it's just really frustrating and absurd, like just how this is being used as like just a both sides kind of thing, and just used for like to drive like arguments about false equivalency between the parties and among Twitter and all this stuff. And it's like, Biden was barely involved.
Yeah.
And to the extent he was involved, he was fully justified.
Yeah. And again, that is the version of the story that is being presented by biased people.
Yeah, exactly.
Like by biased people looking at the evidence in a biased way.
Yeah.
Even they are presenting information that completely exonerates Biden.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, yeah, it's crazy. And the fact that Musk himself is coming out and being like, well, this violates the First Amendment, and like,
no, it doesn't.
It doesn't. It's just so clear that it
even
doesn't.
Technically what it looks like Trump was doing, which on the surface looks more screwy.
Mm-hmm.
Even that probably wouldn't violate it unless he was coercing them.
Yeah. Or acting under like the color of law, making it seem as if he in his executive decision was saying they had to do this.
Yeah. Like, again, it'd be screwy.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be against the First Amendment.
Exactly. And the other thing is like, I find it so silly. It seems so absurd to me. People seem so surprised that Twitter would ever do anything like this. And it's like, what fucking planet are you on? Like, I was literally in an airport, right? And I was reading a book that had, that was a cover that, was politically related. And this young woman like came up to me and was like, hey, have you heard about the Twitter files? It looks like both sides are the same. Biden's people are just as corrupt. This might be the greatest violation of the First Amendment in the modern era, was what she said. And I was like, and I literally said back to her, I was like, Twitter's a for-profit company. Why would anybody expect that to be a public square?
Yeah.
I mean, like, maybe it should be. Like, maybe it should be. But at this point, like, they are a platform that actively manages the content on the platform.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, if
you want to have an argument to drive users, like, that's
if you want to have an argument about social media companies being regulated as public utilities, let's have that conversation.
Sure.
All right. But they aren't.
Yeah. And to be on the delusion that your social media is somehow like a representation of the best or the most fair or the most transparent arguments or anything like that is just delusional.
Yeah. And look, on principle, I don't like what they do, because on principle, I think it violates free speech a lot of the time. But that's not a violation of the law.
Yeah.
It's not. It's just not. So there was another dump from Barry Weiss. And in a lot of ways, hers was more substantive, but it still didn't really give a lot of evidence. It also had something that was just a straight up fucking lie. So she was making the claim that Twitter has always argued that they don't do shadow bans, but that they actually do shadow bans. So let's understand the way that she is defining shadow banning and the way that Twitter has defined shadow banning. So the way she is defining shadow banning is when you limit the reach of certain users, right? Again, this is her definition. Usually the way it would be done would be you limit the reach by saying that they can only be seen by themselves and by their followers or by their followers who retweet their stuff, right? Which means that if you're not following them, you're not going to see their stuff.
It's not promoted by the algorithm at all.
Exactly. The way that Twitter defines shadow banning, and this was how they define it. Quote, deliberately making someone's content undiscoverable to everyone except the person who posted it, unbeknownst to the original poster.
Gotcha.
So that's not the same thing.
Yeah, it's just a much more extreme form of banning.
It's an extreme.
Or shadow banning.
Yeah, it's. Well, no, that is shadow banning.
Yeah.
Her definition was not shadow banning.
Yeah,
was their definition of shadow banning. What she was claiming was that they in the past have said that they don't shadow ban, but they actually do. You know, what she said, which is you limit the reach of the person based on their algorithm. You make it so that they can't show it, that like if you're not already following them, you're not going to see it. All right. That's what she was saying shadow banning is. And she was saying that Twitter was lying when they said that they don't shadow ban. But by their own definition of shadow banning, they don't shadow ban.
Yeah, she was just moving the goalpost and then claiming that they violated it. Yeah.
Exactly. So already it's just completely a lie, completely misleading. She also kept pointing out specific examples of people who received that like do not amplify, like they're put on the do not amplify list, or they can't trend. Like there's also a trends blacklist.
Claiming is shadow banning.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there was an example of some Stanford doctor who said that COVID lockdowns would harm children, and he was put on the trends blacklist. Now, the implication is that he was on this list because of that, but she doesn't provide direct evidence for that.
Sure.
It's just he said this and he was banned. There's no actual evidence that she provides specifically about that. A similar thing happens when she talks about how Dan Bongino and Charlie Kirk, who are both conservative commentators, were also placed on blacklists. But again, she doesn't specifically provide any evidence that they were placed on it because of their political views. All right. The one thing that she does suggest is that they're disproportionately harming conservatives, but the only evidence is pointing out that some of the blacklist accounts were conservatives.
Which is, that by definition, you can't represent a disproportionate impact without comparing the proportions of impact.
Exactly. So if you need to show us the comparisons of how many people who are on the left were also
it's
also
it's like being a kid
on
and you
list.
Stack up your cookies and you're like, my brother got more cookies than me.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing is, it might be true, but she doesn't provide evidence of it. And the thing is, she had all of the evidence in front of her, and she has a bias where she's working backwards from her conclusion. So I feel like if that evidence was there, she would have presented it.
Sure.
All right? If she was actually good at her job, and her job in this case is to try to prove, like, not even to be a journalist, but to prove that there is some type of disproportionality, she would have showed those numbers. And she didn't. She didn't show those numbers. She just used a few examples. Now, I know that there are plenty of leftists who have been banned from Twitter, all right, who have been put on the blacklist for trending, who have been put on the do not amplify list. I know that. I know for a fact that that happens, all right? But the question is, does it happen equally, all right? Now, one thing that's kind of interesting about all of this is that there was actually a study done in 2021 where Twitter was trying to look at its algorithm, specifically study its algorithm. And they examined data in 7 different countries, all right? United Kingdom, United States, Canada, France, Germany, Spain, and Japan. And they were trying to figure out what type of messages were the ones that the algorithm was amplifying.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found was it was actually amplifying right-wing messages more than left-wing messages. Now, to be clear, that's not necessarily evidence that they're purposely doing that. It's just the algorithm, all right? You could even, in fact, conservatives could look at that. They could point to that specific study and say, well, that's because our content is more engaging.
Sure.
You know, and honestly, I would probably do that. Like if it were reversed and it was saying that it was actually amplifying left-wing messages, I would probably say, well, that's because we're better than you.
Naturally.
You know?
If you didn't say so much stupid shit.
Yeah, but of course they're not doing this.
Sure.
They're not pointing to this specific study because this specific study completely flies in the face of the claim that they've been trying to make for years and years.
Yeah,
all
it's
right?
not dispositive that there is right-wing bias, but it is evidence that there may be right-wing bias.
Yeah, and it's also pretty blatant evidence that there
Isn't left-wing bias.
Exactly.
Yeah.